Hello, and welcome to our podcast today, which is a precursor to the conference that we're hosting in 36 days, which is Responsible Supply Chains, the Future of Trade, on the 31st of October, 1st of November. And just to give us a taster for the conference, we're going to have a conversation with ELEVATE and ETI, specifically with Ian Spaulding, CEO of ELEVATE, and Peter McAllister, Executive Director of ETI. So I've got a few questions I'd like to put to you both to sort of kickstart a conversation that hopefully people can listen to on their way into or out of work as a taster of further conversations that will be happening in the conference at the Kia Oval. So first of all, what I'd really like to do is just get your insights and views on what we're seeing in respect to current trends in responsible sourcing. And perhaps I'll put that question to you first, Ian.
Sure. Thanks, Erin. And thank you, Peter, for joining us. We're excited to partner with ETI and celebrate 20 years of great work that the ETI has done in ethical trade. And so for ELEVATE to be part of that team, we're excited. So thank you for that. With respect to the question, Erin, that you've asked about trends in our industry, I think we've seen a number of trends emerge over the last few years. One trend in particular is convergence or mutual recognition, how more and more companies are beginning to, try and aspire to that one audit, one code, one framework, if you will, to get visibility into their supply chain. And so we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of companies, retailers, and brands using schemes such as SEDEX, such as BSCI, RAP, S8000. I think largely driven by companies like Walmart and Li and Fung and Disney. There is a fair bit of convergence, and that's good and bad news. And I think we're gonna talk a little bit about that with some of our academic friends who are going to join us, who've studied auditing over the years and how things have improved and enhanced. But ultimately, we're going to hear from a number of different stakeholders at the conference about how one trend of mutual recognition and convergence is one that has some promises, but also some challenges for our industry. So that's just one example of what we'll cover.
Great. And Peter, from your perspective, what sort of current trends are you witnessing?
So Ian, it's great to be working with you all at ELEVATE and also looking forward to the conference. Convergence, I think you're right on the money. That's the desire to look at greater efficiency, reduce the overlap, harmonizing approaches. I think also companies are just as aware as we are. It's probably a more competitive environment than I can remember, a more disruptive environment than I can remember, whether you look at market trends or you look at politics, regulation, and trade, all of which we'll talk to. More and more effort around the use of technology. How can technology help here? How does technology interact with the sort of things that we've been doing and make that more efficient and effective? We're seeing really positive conversations about supplier ownership. How do you make sure suppliers are part of the drive to make sure we've got supply chains we can be proud of rather than people at the receiving end? So I think there's some good initiatives out there touching on that. And something that ETI, is dear to our heart, examples of collaboration. So obviously off the back of the Rana Plaza tragedy, we saw the Accord and the Alliance, but we're seeing things like ACT getting to grips with issues like wages. We're seeing Consumer Goods Forum work on forced labour, collaboration around Thai fishing. And I think on those big systemic issues, we're going to see more forms of collaboration trying to tackle these things.
Great, thank you. And that's sort of what we've seen, what we're seeing so far. What I'd maybe like to explore now is predictions for the future. And Peter, you're celebrating 20 years so far. So reflecting on what's happened past, now we shift forward for the next 20 years. Perhaps where do you envisage what predict is going to be coming next?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we just better get used to uncertainty. The pace of change, the nature of change, whether that's technological sourcing models, geographic shift. I think business just has to be more agile, and therefore people like ourselves and ELEVATE and those working around that ecosystem also have to be agile. Doing what we did 2 or 3 years ago is just not going to be good enough. I think the winners will be strategic. There's a lot of tactical work that needs to be done, but I think the winners are going to be those that ride those big trends, make those big bets, take sort of courage in their hands and experiment. And I think we're also facing into an environment where there's going to be greater regulation, greater investor scrutiny. So there's going to be a lot more for companies to have to absorb and plot their way through. And again, something dear to our heart is I think we need to move beyond conversations around worker engagement and worker voice to realizing that they're agents in change. Where there are unions in place, then we should be brave and confident of working with unions. And when there aren't unions in place, how do we make sure workers are really involved in the conversations in the future?
Great. Yeah. And Ian, in Elevate Future, what are we looking at?
Well, a couple of things. I would say that the industry is definitely, due to one of the trends that we just covered in terms of mutual recognition and convergence, I think we're seeing also a professionalization of the industry and a lot more maturing. And that's leading to what I hope to be better, fewer audits as the industry professionalizes a bit more, just like the American Bar Association or chartered accountancy professionalized, hundreds of years ago. I think this industry is also professionalizing, maturing. In addition, I would say, look, the size of factories is reducing for the most part. We see not only change in where companies are buying product from, but they're actually buying smaller quantities, which means the factory size is getting smaller, which means ultimately you can't get the kinds of efficiencies that factories used to have. And that's a trend and a prediction in the future, is that we're going to see lots of smaller factories because we just don't see the quantities that we used to. And another might be just relating to data. So, we're collecting a lot of data that comes in through auditing, through worker voice, through grievance mechanisms, through a number of different technologies that are being deployed by a variety of different companies. When you pull all that data together, it gives us greater insight into risk and ultimately helping companies predict the likelihood that factories will improve their performance. So I think that sort of lake of data that we're creating, everyone in the industry is ultimately helping to inform risk in a very different manner than what existed 20 years ago when ETI was founded.
And Ian, if I might ask, and we talked about this when we last met, are we almost coming to a sort of technology 2.0 in the ethical space? There were some sort of early forays, but that ability to use data, that ability to collect and use things in real time, do you see that becoming a real driver of change?
I do, in that, it's just, I think more and more companies are focused on the data and what it means, and then they're using the data. I think in the past, we've just collected data, but not really used it or analyzed it or correlated it. And I think because there's a lot more scrutiny about what the industry does and forcing the industry to prove impact, I think a lot of people are beginning to look at the data and begin to say, we know going into that relationship, the likelihood that factory or that farm is going to change, or the likelihood they're going to comply. And I think that begins to liberate companies to begin to think a little differently about how they prioritize. So you talked about supplier ownership. I think we're going to see further efforts for suppliers to take their own sort of future and begin to sort of implement their own ethical sourcing or trading programs, and then demonstrate to their retail customers that, hey, why do you have to focus on us? Let's go, work on other factories or vendors or trading companies that actually do not have the robust program that exists. And a lot of that is coming from a realization that the audit-only model only took us so far. Now we need to introduce that 2.0 model that you're referencing and begin to read the reports, read the data, correlate it, and then use that to segment supply chains and then come up with a better strategy to drive impact.
Great, thank you. Ian, you talked there about this lake of data. I'm quite interested to just explore that a little bit in terms of how do we organize that lake? What do we anticipate that will look like moving forward? Who are the sort of the swimmers in the lake? Who needs to be looking at that information? How can we explore that data levels?
Sure. Well, I mean, the analogy that I heard in the debate about forced labor and how things are working was an analogy sort of going back to the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s, when many pharmaceutical companies were focused on drugs that would be impactful to address issues of HIV and AIDS. And it was only when folks began to pull drugs together and create a drug cocktail where the potency of those drugs actually began to improve. And so if you use that analogy to apply it to our industry, for many, many years, we've all been individually working on either auditing or worker engagement or worker voice. And very few companies were really trying to pull a number of different data sources, including purchasing practices and purchase orders and quality data together into that data lake. And I think when we begin to do that, I think we're going to see the potency of our respective ethical trade programs improve as we understand what's in the data lake and what it actually tells us about improvement and the likelihood of improvement. So it's not one stakeholder, it's kind of a number of folks that collect data and information, both inside and outside the factory, both inside and outside the company, pulling that together to begin to see whether that data actually tells a story that's impactful and meaningful. And if it doesn't, I think that's when that also leads to some terrific outcomes, because it forces companies to rethink their entire program.
Yeah.
And Ian, we said when we were planning this that we probably wouldn't agree on everything, and so that's healthy. I don't doubt for a minute you're right in the sense of companies getting smart about using data in this area, and that ability then to predict things and to be more strategic. I think we're in full agreement on that. My worry in all of this, of course, is we still really don't have the methods, the technology, the frameworks where workers are contributing their own versions, and how do you turn that into data? So I agree with you. I think that's the right journey, and we have to help companies use that. But a little cautionary note that we're still absent one of the key players in this, which is workers from the shop floor, from the farm, and how do we get the data that really reflects their concerns and their issues and their priorities. So a cautionary note on what otherwise I think you're right is going to be a big issue to watch in the future.
No, and I totally agree, and I don't think we should not suggest that the way in which we engage workers today has somehow worked or that it is effective. I think we all get challenged on that issue about how do we put workers more at the center of ethical trade, and I think it's a very important and healthy debate among corporates to defend how their model actually improves workers' lives day to day. And I think the one hope of glimmer, why I view the world of our industry in sort of a glass half full, is that we see continuing experimentation and innovation in this space. And so I am hopeful that maybe today's experimentation becomes tomorrow's standard practice for the industry.
Indeed.
Yeah, I want to come back on that one a little bit. I think, Peter, you said earlier that it's those companies that experiment and get themselves involved in some tactical work that you see as they're the ones who are going to succeed moving forward. What do you see as within companies? What are the catalysts for these experiments, and where's the sort of the starting point for these experiments, and how in the 20 years that you've witnessed, what makes a successful experiment really work and get to scale? What does it need right from the beginning?
Good question. I think there's two parts that, what gets a company doing something that's different. Sometimes, unfortunately, takes a tragedy or the fact that company's in the news or being campaigned against, and that's quite legitimate, and that provides an impetus. But it's not enough. I think you also need strong values, so that a company says, yeah, actually, this resonates with us, and we want to do something about it. And we often see that in family-owned companies or companies where the ownership is very strong. And then you need champions. You need people who, as we often say, get the agenda and are willing to put their efforts into getting their company, their business, or even their peers together on a topic. Look, it's not easy. If it was easy, it would be done. I think these issues, whether it's around wages, whether it's around worker engagement, we talked about health and safety, which caught us all out 5 years ago. We can never be relaxed. There's always something that we need to be doing more about. But I think that sense of purpose, the sense of values, the sense of courage, because frankly, it's easier to run with the herd on these issues than it is to be out front. Just ask H&M at the moment, or if you ask Adidas or anybody else who's been in the firing line at times, that's not the easy option. But it's what we need. And I think unless you have that courage, unless you have that conviction that in the long run, this is going to drive a better business environment for us, and that is going to be in terms of all stakeholders, from returns on shareholding to attracting and retaining great staff, and having supply chains that underpin your good business. So overcoming all those barriers requires that leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I just want to maybe put to you and maybe put to all of the people coming to the conference or thinking of coming to the conference is one of the things we talked about earlier, you talked about was the professionalization of the industry. Have we got the skills we need? And I kind of throw it open to all of us, all of the conference delegates. What other skills do we need? Are we the right people in the right jobs? Where do you see this industry going in terms of how it's being staffed and the position within a company of the people doing responsible trade at the moment?
Yeah, Ian, I'm sure it's the same for you. I mean, I meet a lot of really smart, motivated people working very hard to drive change, and you sort of reflect, well, then why don't we see more change than you'd think we'd get by applying those people together? And I think partly this moves into the area of political and trade. Not all these issues are business issues. We sometimes bump up against, a failure of good governance, and there's only so much an individual business can do on that. But also, I'm still concerned that sometimes the senior execs really don't know what they don't know. Once you get senior execs on an issue, a company moves. If it's being driven at lower levels, even by the smartest people on the planet, you don't necessarily have the business engaged. So, Ian, I don't know if you agree with me. Unless you get a core business involved in an issue, just don't get that same sort of engagement and traction.
No, I of course I've had lots of wounds just because we haven't had the right CFO or finance person or senior leader at the table, and therefore a lot of really good intentions that don't necessarily result in the kind of change or impact that we all want. But I do think that there's some change happening. I think the legislation that is being passed in a number of jurisdictions, which I'm sure we'll talk about at the conference, is actually waking up a number of senior executives that it's no longer just a public relations or reputational issue. It's actually a legal requirement. In addition to that, we see what Blackstone has done with Larry Flink in terms of demanding that investments that Blackstone does actually have a positive impact on society, and so forcing the companies that they hold to take more action in order to drive results on environmental and social issues. I think that will help. And in addition, I just see, to your earlier point, Peter, about how retail and trade is going through a tremendous amount of uncertainty. In that uncertainty, where a lot of retailers are struggling, I think you begin to have finance folks begin to question everything. And when that happens, it obviously is scary for some folks in our industry and CSR who have been operating a certain way. But it actually is potentially a good thing in that it forces more scrutiny as to what are we doing and is it actually achieving the kinds of results that we need. Some of the most effective programs that we've seen in our industry come from companies that actually have the finance function actively involved, and they want to ensure that there's a good return on investment for the investment they're making in their supply chain. So I'm hopeful that plus all the laws and a number of attention that's out there from the ESG community or the financial community is going to wake up a number of senior executives in large corporates in order to take more care and oversight of this function.
I certainly agree with that, and for all the reasons you just said, I think we see more engagement. We just need to see that critical mass develop.
Yeah, absolutely. And one word that jumped out of there to me was uncertainty, which has been mentioned quite a lot by both of you in the course of this conversation. And I guess the next word that you automatically leap to when you hear uncertainty at the moment is Brexit. Peter, we're based here in the UK, so I'm interested to get your view on what you think the impact of Brexit will be on this agenda. What can we expect?
Well, if I had that answer, I guess I would be selling it to the highest bidder. What we do know, listen, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the wider trade wars that are going on at the moment, we know that when there's change, when there is uncertainty, that the most vulnerable tend to be in the worst position. So our big concern is whether that's workers who are seasoned in the UK, whether that's how the UK then changes trading relationships with others. The vulnerable workers are always the ones that we need to worry most about because they have the least recourse. I don't know how Brexit's going to pan out at the moment. What sort of deal they're going to have with the EU? What sort of deal we're then going to negotiate with big trading partners like Malaysia or India or Brazil or wherever. I am concerned that not enough attention will be given to the potential risks of that. and therefore there could be unintended negative impacts on the situations around migrant workers or temporary workers or women in the workplace. And therefore, as that becomes clearer, ETI, amongst others, will engage in the debate about where are the checks and balances and how do we make sure we don't undermine good conditions and preferably build in better conditions to the emerging trade arrangements. But for us to get involved in that debate, we need to see exactly what the lines of Brexit are going to be.
Yeah, still waiting. So Ian, I guess you get to watch us from Hong Kong in this period of flux and uncertainty, but obviously being someone who's from the US, perhaps you'd like to comment on your views on Brexit, but also maybe the trade wars and how they're having an impact on responsible supply chains or an approach to responsible supply chains as well.
Sure. Well, as an American citizen, I think we are very proud of our trade policy. It's incredibly clear and well understood about all stakeholders around the world. It means that I'm joking, of course. There's a lot of uncertainty with American trade policy as this massive nationalist movement is happening, and most trade agreements are being questioned, from NAFTA to South Korea and pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and now with a trade war that literally starts today between the United States and China, with $256 billion of imports actually having a 10% tariff put on it. So that uncertainty is actually leading to a lot of corporates to begin to question, where are they buying product? How do they onboard a lot of new factories in South and Southeast Asia, which ultimately is going to create even potential some bankruptcies, some reduction in orders, layoffs in China, and et cetera. So we may see companies even in Europe and the UK sourcing from China that actually have a spillover effect as a result of the trade war. You could actually see bankruptcies that come into trading partners in Asia that are selling into the UK or Europe. So hopefully cooler heads will prevail, and we're going to see countries begin to negotiate new trade agreements that ultimately will be better for UK as well as Europe and the United States and China. But I would say, at least for the next couple of years, we should anticipate similar challenges with trade policy, which means everyone who comes to this conference just has to be ready for continued change and disruption. Because I don't see any clarity about trade policy from governance coming in the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're talking about people coming to the conference. I think this is a good time as well to just maybe call out a few of the sessions where we're going to take a much deeper dive with a whole host of close to sort of 50 speakers, really examining a lot of the topical issues of the time. So I just wanted to ask both of you which sessions you were looking forward to and what topics you're looking to explore in more detail. So perhaps, Peter, if you can give us your insight on those sessions you're looking forward to.
Thank you. Well, what I've enjoyed working with Elevate, very much in tune with ourselves, is how to make this event worthwhile coming to. How can it be practical and useful? Yes, we want to do some challenging thinking about the future and get the juices flowing, but also people need to take away practical examples about what they can do in their organization or their business based on coming to the conference. So we've got some inspiring speakers. I'm looking forward to that. We've got a variety of issues, particularly pleased that we're going to be seeing workers there. As it's ETI, we'll have unions and NGOs as well as business, all of whom bring particular insights to things. But in terms of issues I wanted to bring out, I'm looking forward to other perspectives on the future, which way supply chain is going, looking at what the future supply chain might look like, and Leah Fung's going to lead us on a conversation there. Particularly interested on the conversation about transforming business models. To what extent do business models need to adapt not only to the world we've been talking about, but also to deliver on the promises that we all hope we'll finally achieve. So a couple of examples there that I'm looking forward to.
Okay, great. Ian?
Great. Well, I mean, I'm excited that this is such a big group, right? We're talking about more than 50 different speakers, more than 250 different participants, a very diverse audience, a good mix of corporates and NGOs and trade unions, workers, as well as factories there. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that this is not an academic conversation, that we keep it real, as we say, and very practical, to Peter's point. I think, look, the companies that are coming in terms of what they're going to present, I love that kick is coming, a value retailer from Germany, going to talk a little bit about how they've taken some of the learnings from Bangladesh and applied it to Pakistan. Danone and Nestle and Reckitt Benckiser and Inditex and H&M are all doing some really interesting things there. But the fact that we have Mark Goldrin, from the CEO of Oxfam, joining us, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of conversation about Oxfam and what they're doing to promote ethical trade and the role they play. And I'm looking forward to his talk. And then having Ribana Haq from Mohammadi Group from Bangladesh talk about what's happening there and the trends that are happening under with the Accord and the Alliance, at least from a factory perspective. I think it'll remind a lot of us what happened 5.5 years ago and how much progress we've made, but also probably a call to action that our work is not yet done in Bangladesh. So I think it's a pretty diverse group of folks there, and we just have to keep everybody on time and everyone very pragmatic, and let's hope we can actually come out of that with some pretty good learnings that people can walk away from that conference saying, hey, I got some real value from attending the 2 days.
Yeah, definitely. So just a reminder that the conference being on the 31st of October and the 1st of November. So we're spanning a couple of months over the 2 days with lots of different types of sessions as well. So we'll hear from panels, we'll have discussions, we'll have lots of networking opportunities, which is always a real key focus of any conference. And then some short, snappy presentations on very particular issues as well, like employment injury insurance, purchasing practices, and the Child Rights and Business Atlas, as well as deeper dives into topics like women in the workplace as well. So a huge variety that we've got as well, and lots of different attendees registered so far as well, which is really exciting. So I just want to really ask you both one last question to finish on, and that's really something positive, because in these times of real uncertainty, I think it's really important we focus on the positive as well, and we bring that positivity and we bring that to the conference. So I just want both of you to give me an example of something in the industry. Obviously 20 years of ETI, 10 years of Elevate. What are you most proud of, and what do you think we need to bring with us to the conference next month? So who would like to start us off with that one?
Peter, why don't you start? 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, pride is a funny thing. I'm never satisfied. There's always more to do. But, you know, on the one hand, I'm very, very honored and humbled that I've had a chance to speak to individual workers whose lives have been transformed. And when you see women who feel they can speak up, or that they're now supervisors, or that they're getting paid properly, you know, those small things matter. Now, on the other hand, I'm really proud of the fact that ETI has been involved in some of the big issues in our lifetime, whether it was the creation of the GLA, before it was the GLAA, whether it's really charging the modern slavery agenda, whether it was at the birth of the Accord, some big issues that have got the attention, rightly so, of business. So a lot of things I think we feel proud of. We're never satisfied. There's always more to do, and I hope to be part of the next 10 things that we're all excited about.
Great, thank you. Ian?
Great. Yeah, well, I mean, look, reflecting on where we started from 20 years ago when ETI was founded and where we are today, I think we always lose focus sometimes, and we look down and we see the world as it is today and realize how we've not accomplished what we set out to do. But when we do look back, it's always nice to see that there has been some change. And what I mean by that is 20 years ago, nobody knew where their product was being manufactured. We didn't actually have factory lists. We didn't release factory information publicly. We didn't actually visit factories to get visibility. I think we've got a lot of that blocking and tackling done, and the basics, the fundamentals of ethical trade have been put in place for a lot of corporates. And that has led to primarily what might be considered kind of a crossroads moment right now that will influence the next 20 years of ethical trade. And so what I'm hopeful for is that we take the lessons from the last 20 years, realize that we did accomplish a couple of really good things, but recognize that while our work is not done, there are some key learnings that we can take away. You know, one of which is we cannot boil the ocean. You have to pick and choose where you're going to drive change. And those factories, those relationships where people have strategic partnerships with, they can kind of see the results and the impact on the ground. And the Accord and the Alliance are good examples of that, because there's been a tremendous amount of consolidation in the industry as stronger factories get better and weaker factories go out of business. And I do think that's an important lesson, because this race to the bottom that the industry has been on, constantly looking for cheaper prices and moving around the world, we've hit bottom, and or at least I hope we have. And ultimately, we're now in a point where we can ask brands and retailers to take the lessons of the last 20 years and focus on how do we consolidate, how do we buy more from fewer factories, how do we use that leverage to try and influence behavior, driving the kinds of trends that Peter, you talked about with supplier ownership. And that ultimately will allow us to step away from the audit-only model and put more, put workers more at the center of our activities. And that would mean the next 20-year model is going to be very different from the last 20 years. And I think we're at that crossroads. So that's why I'm hopeful that these lessons will come out in the 2-day conference, and companies will walk away from it saying, all right, maybe I can tweak my program this way or that way to drive the kinds of results that are going to have greater impact.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so what we're looking forward to is 2 days where we do some more tactical work. We maybe start some experiments. We cut through the chaos and uncertainty and really help the attendees get on a path that's fit for the future. Again, that's the 31st of October, 1st of November. If you want to register, you can do so on the Elevate and ETI websites. If you like what you've heard or you want to make a comment, then please do so. You can, using the hashtag Responsible Supply Chains 18, get in touch with us directly. The details of who to speak to are on, again, both the Elevate and ETI websites, and you can register that way. We really look forward to having you join us, and I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation with Ian and Peter. So thank you ever so much for having this conversation today, and we look forward to seeing you in London on the 31st of October and the 1st of November. Thank you both.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Peter. Cheers.